Good afternoon, everyone. It's Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live. I'm your host for today's show, Heather Shea Gasser, broadcasting live from my professional home here at Michigan State University. Today, I am pleased to welcome the editors of the book, Job 1 2.0, Understanding the Next Generation of Student Affairs Professionals, as well as one of the authors of one of the chapters to today's show. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live Network, which is a series of professional development web shows and podcasts, which are always free and accessible to you in our archives at higheredlive.com and on iTunes. Higher Ed Live has recently launched a new channel, Marketing Live, which is hosted by Amy Jorgensen and Tim Jones. And Marketing Live actually debuts tomorrow. Same time, same place, here at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Want to welcome you all to the show and then also invite anybody who's watching to participate in the conversation by sharing your questions and insights via the Higher Ed Live hashtag on Twitter. So I just wanted to encourage everybody to tweet your questions to our guests today. You can also receive weekly updates about our shows and learn about upcoming episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter, and we'll be sending out some information about that via Twitter. Today's show would not be possible without the support of Michigan State University and our producer, M. Stoner, which is a marketing and communications firm that works with educational institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. So on with the show. As I said, today we're going to be talking with the editors of the newly released second edition of the book, Job 1 2.0, Understanding the Next Generation of Student Affairs Professionals. And I am deeply grateful to Jill Carnegie and Peter Magolda for joining me to talk about this book. Two people who really don't need much of an introduction, but I'll tell you a little bit about them. Jill Carnegie is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Students and Dean of Campus Life at Washington University in St. Louis. And Peter Magolda is a professor in Miami University of Ohio's Student Affairs in Higher Education program. As a last-minute addition, I'm also pleased to introduce Molly Pearson, who contributed one of the chapters in the book about her own Job 1 experience. And Molly works as the Assistant Director of Off-Campus Students at Washington University in St. Louis with Jill. So they are joining us together today. Again, as I said, please tweet your questions or insights to the Higher Ed Live hashtag. And I just want to thank all of my guests and everyone watching our live stream today for taking the time out of your schedules and joining us on Student Affairs Live. So I'd like to start by asking a little bit about how this book came about and what you saw as the purpose. Peter, do you want to address this one?
Sure. Hard to believe it, about a dozen years ago, somewhere around 2001 or 2, Jill and I began a conversation around the topic of new professionals, and a lot of that conversation really originated with conversations we were having with new professionals and graduate students at the time, and many of the graduate students and our academic program felt very strongly that much of the literature about new professionals, while interesting and useful, seemed somewhat detached from their lived experiences. And at the same time, I think many of these students go out and about looking at jobs, visiting campuses, trying to make decisions, and ultimately moving to new places. And in that process, we seem to have quite a few interesting stories about their particular experiences. Excuse me. So we sort of, in some ways, sort of began to think about ways to possibly make use of some of the senior student affairs folks and faculty people who are writing about this and trying to merge that with some of the new professional experiences that were going on. And so back then we came up with this sort of strange idea of really allowing and inviting new professionals and graduate students to really write about their particular experiences, and then using the wisdom of folks who have been in the profession for a long time to sort of act as discussants and reactors and sort of connect their ideas to each other, as well as, I think, connect some of the ideas to some of the theoretical ideas that are the foundation of our profession. And so it was really sort of a 2 or 3 year process of trying to identify some folks who had some interesting stories, trying to get those stories in a way that sort of sequence some of the issues that seem to be very important to contemporary students, at least students back then, and then really sort of sending it out to folks and hoping that we might engage in some ongoing dialogue about that, about the new professional experiences.
Great. Peter, could you talk about how Job 1 has been utilized in ongoing professional development? Or Jill, either one.
I mean, I can start. And with both books, we've done extended sessions and various sessions at both ACPA and NASPA, as well as Peter and I hopefully are ready, or soon to be ready, for the 3rd annual Phyllis Mabel Institute for New Professionals. And we're thrilled that this second book's out just in time for the participants at this one to read the book, to look at the stories, and I think we're going to, we had a great 2-year run when we did this in DC, or at least I thought we did. And so this year, because the book's just out, that's one of the reading assignments, really the only reading assignment. And I think the new professionals will begin to place themselves, they'll relate to a variety of different stories in the book. I think, I think because you asked us to do this, and Peter and I can't believe we said yes, it was a moment. But for me to prepare for it and think about it, it really gave me pause about all the different pieces that would be helpful as to continue forward in how I'd utilize this book and do our work with the storytelling, the reflection, the journaling, because I think that was an important piece for these new professionals with both editions, to tell their stories, and the stories that are in the final product of each of these books were really a work in progress and took many drafts, many conversations. And I think Peter and I are incredibly appreciative of the risk these people took, the trust they put in us, and to tell their story for people kind of anywhere and everywhere to pick up. And I think some of these stories took different twists than they initially started out. I mean, I don't know if Molly or Peter, you've got stuff to add with that one.
Mm-hmm. Molly, you want to share a little bit about how your story evolved during that process? I think that's kind of an interesting sub-theme.
Sure. So a little bit of context for my story, my first job. It was really about transitioning out of a job after 1 year and kind of making that decision. And so a lot of my reflection was happening in a new role that I had taken on. And so really thinking back to where was I kind of through the process of making that decision throughout that entire year, and kind of remaining my commitment to my current job, preparing myself for another transition, having just kind of started and getting settled into my first job. And I think the process of writing it was, I think I learned a lot about myself, about why that job in particular wasn't a good fit for me, and why my current job, it kind of almost reinvigorated me in my current job, and knowing that the choices I had made had been the right choices, and that I found myself in a place where my skill set was really meeting the student need within the job that I had moved into. And so I think for me, the process, it was definitely hard to get back into writing. I think being out of graduate school for 2 or 3 years, it was a challenge to sit down and really write a good lengthy piece of work. And I think actually getting it into writing, I think for me, allowed me really to reflect and learn more than I had just going through the process itself.
And I think one thing that was interesting to Peter and myself is when we started the second book and we went back to who were new professionals in the first book, we were amazed that everybody was still in the field.
Wow.
With research and scholarship, and Peter probably has the numbers more at the top of his head, but those who usually leave. And, you know, I think it was an aha moment, at least for me, and I can't subscribe any cause and effect to it, but the fact that folks are still in the profession, have vibrant roles in it, have moved on, some have stayed and been promoted, that was most interesting in intervening, what was it, 8 or so years, Peter? Oh.
Yeah,
Molly, go ahead. Go ahead, Peter.
there were 10 new professionals who wrote in the edition published in 2004, and actually all 10 of those are still in the profession, and 9 of them actually contributed. And a unique, I think, contribution and aspect of this second edition is that we actually invited, as we said, 9 of the 10 original new professionals to act as discussants for the second edition, and so most, if not all of them, were in mid and rising senior positions, and they had some very, very interesting insights about the stories, but also had a clear recollection of what it was like to sort of reveal their own story and make public their own story as well. So I think in that process of identifying these very interesting folks, it seems to, the book seems to have worked well with all 4 audiences we intended. So I think first, we wanted to use it as a possible graduate preparation text to help people with that transition. And so we've learned over the years that many capstone courses will use this as one of many different kinds of texts that introduce folks to some issues. Clearly, I think folks who don't actually use it in class, graduate students just find it as a useful text, or at least have reported it's a useful text to them as they think about some of these challenging issues of interviewing and making job decisions. Clearly, I think the ones that have benefited most, and I think most surprised, were supervisors of new professionals, because it seems to be a really potent professional development vehicle. So it's interesting to have folks sit around, and I've participated in numerous sessions where folks have read 1 or 2 chapters and a couple stories and some analyses, and then using that as a springboard to discuss topics that we all know are very important, but seldom get an opportunity to explicitly talk about, given our sort of busy day in and day out life.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to a good friend of mine who was actually going to be on the show today, but then had something come up, Kathleen Gardner, whose chapter with her partner appears in both the first book as well as a follow-up in the second book. So, you know, I think that model is really effective in terms of looking back and having those professionals from the first book reflect and look at the ideas from the second book. Could you talk a little bit more, though, about how you went about soliciting authors? What perspectives did you feel really were important to include, and how you've kind of talked about the structure a little bit, but for those who haven't read it, how you go about pairing those reflective essays with the new professionals' experiences?
I'd like to say we had it all incredibly thought out, planned, and orchestrated the plan incredibly well. I think we had a jumping off point for the first book of, for some people that may be watching this, if you haven't even heard of the book or seen it, the first book we divided into 3 sections, and we were looking at stories that graduates, new professionals could tell about the search for their first job and what all that entailed. The second section of the book had to do with being in the first job and focused on identity and supervisors. I mean, all the different pieces of it. Or no, it was the first job and issues around that, early days in the new job. And then the third section has to do about identity. When I say identity, it could be incredibly far-ranging. Able-bodiedness, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity expression. And, I mean, we had an idea of who we wanted to go after, but it wasn't like by bucket or category, and some of them because Peter and I both worked in institutions that have professional preparation programs, and I've been out of those kind of institutions for quite a while now. And then we solicited our colleagues. We're really looking for somebody that has an interesting story to tell, and as some of these individuals started to write their stories, the stories took on, it really didn't fall under identity, it might have shifted to the search process or early days. And so the structure worked for the first one, and we continued the sections by looking for the job, first day's transition orientation into an identity for the second. It's called a second edition. I think we could argue that it is or it isn't, because then we switched up the analysis of each section. When the first pairing we paired a professional, we're all professionals, but a administrator, staff type person and a faculty member. And that was interesting to watch that evolve, and we clearly realized that people were self-aware and made good choices of whether they should be the faculty route or the practitioner route. That was interesting in and of itself. So the second go-around, as Peter said, we took new professionals that are now mid-professionals to write the analysis. And then if you look at some of the last sections of the each chapter, some of them then did a reflection like, oh my God, this is where I was as a new professional, and I can't believe I obsessed about what kind of paper I used for my resume, or some of the more superficial pieces. So to watch there and listen to them talk about their growth and maturity as a professional has been fascinating. You know, even when people talk about, oh, your book's out or whatever, it clearly, in my mind, is not my book. It's really Peter and I being kind of the gatekeepers of these incredibly, I think, important stories, and kind of being the trust of moving forward what individuals had to say that they might not have shared with others, or even kind of, I didn't realize not that it's retrospective sense-making, but in reflection, they came up with some different aha moments. And the one woman that went to California for the interim job, never had been out there. I mean, I think then she came to realize how strong a risk taker she is and how willing she was to take the risk. But I don't know if she knew she was doing that at the time she was doing it. But Peter, you may have another.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about, that particular question, I think we were very intentional in trying to find folks who not only did interesting things, but were quite reflective about what they did. We were also interested in sort of soliciting folks from many, many different kinds of graduate programs, since there's so much variance in those programs, and those experiences are very influential. So we tried to focus on that. We were also interested in trying to get some folks from various kinds of institutions, so private and public, but as you'll see, some that are in different countries, different parts of the world, have very, very different mission statements. And so we attempted, I think, in ways to sort of try to get as interesting as a cross-section as possible. I think the one thing that sort of transcends all of the contributors in both editions are folks who are not just reflective and not just willing and interested in writing, and as Molly said, interested in getting probably more feedback than they ever expected or wanted, was really the idea of, we wanted folks that were willing to take some risks, to talk about things that went well, and also things that didn't go particularly well in the process. And it's most interesting is that, at least in my use of the text over the years, it's the folks who are really brutally honest and provide sort of unvarnished sense of their own insecurities, their own struggles, that have really resonated with, I think, readers, and have really provided, again, another opportunity for people to discuss things that are topics that are very difficult to discuss. And so those were some of the things. The other thing that I think we were extremely purposeful, excuse me, was trying to not sort of create a tiered system of contributors. And I think we approached it from the outset of trying to position all of these folks as scholar practitioners, but not faculty, not administrators, not graduate students, not new professionals, but all folks who are scholar practitioners who have varying years of experience and varying life experiences. And I think we try to, and you can see in some of the chapters, there's some folks who talk and integrate theory very naturally in their stories, there's some that don't. And we really wanted it not to be, here's the stories and then here's the important analysis. We really believe that all of the contributors and all the aspects of the text work well together to sort of provide a pretty complex and textured sense of this new job experience.
That's great.
And I don't know if, because Job 1 2.0 is much more recent in my memory, but it seems like we even went for greater diverse stories. The international, the individual that was at Qatar, the other individual that chose a Buddhist institution and really thought about that, more diverse pathways into the field. And part of that was definitely planned. Others of it, as the stories became thicker and richer, there was greater diversity. I mean, I'd put it right out there. We were criticized by some that we did not have a Latino or Latino author. However, we really weren't going for to hit every type. It was really what was the diversity of individuals that had incredibly fascinating stories to tell. Some of these individuals I have never met in person. I would not know who they are. It's through editing back and forth, emails, occasional phone conversation, sometimes more than an occasional phone conversation.
That's great. So we have lots of new professionals who watch Higher Ed Live, as well as folks from all over various levels. But I think, given that one's first job really shapes how they enter into student affairs, what important tips would you like to share that you either gleaned from the stories that you were reading or working with in the book, and then how they can make the most of the process? And I'd love to hear from Molly, too, since her story was really unique as well. Molly, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start us off. I actually, reflecting on it, I sometimes wonder if my story was picked because I feel like I kind of went against the norm of what would be good advice with your first job, which is
don't leave after the first year.
Right. So, staying in a job longer than a year, giving it a second year, giving it a try. And I think, reflecting back on it, I think what's really important is that every first job is a unique experience for anyone. And so I think there are many factors at play when kind of navigating that first year. And I think that one word of advice that I would have is don't jump too quickly to, oh, it's not a good fit, I need to find something else. But really think it through critically and from different angles. So I kind of find myself getting to a place where I felt like, for me personally and professionally, I wasn't getting what I needed out of the job, but almost more importantly, I felt like the department I was working in maybe could find those skill sets and maybe better skill sets than someone else. And so it was really a balance of what were the needs of the department, the students I was working with, and then also what were my personal needs. And I think it wasn't until I'd gotten to that place that I felt confident that pursuing another job made sense, not only for me, but potentially for the work that I was doing in my current position. And so I think that often the first job is a really, I think, important wake-up call to it's really not all about you. Like, you is important in that job. But I think that transition from graduate student to new professional, you really get to understand firsthand that, at least for me, the job really became about the students I was serving and working for and working with, and that I really had to consider their needs and interests when I was making decisions based on kind of what was next for me.
Yeah, and I make that comment having also left my first job after the first year. So your story really resonated for me because it really paralleled my own experience and wanting to move on, not knowing if that was going to hurt me down the road. So thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts about how folks can make the most of that transition period and what advice you'd have for new professionals or current grad students? Phil or Peter?
Well, for me, I'm always nervous about providing advice to anyone except to be skeptical of people who give advice. As I've read the stories and sort of in addition to editing and providing feedback, I spent a fair amount of time, Jill and I, doing sort of cross-case analyses, looking at what are the common issues that seem to transcend all of these different work contexts or different life experiences. And there were a few things that struck me as at least topics that were really, really important to new professionals across those editions. I think one is this whole idea of being patient. There's an awful lot of anxiety around transitions. There's a lot of anxiety around moving to a new place, reestablishing oneself. And in that nervousness, there's a sense of impatience. And so even, so for example, with some of the more contemporary folks in the second edition, the economy clearly influences people's sense of nervousness about getting a job. And so people sometimes will move quickly to take a job that is a job rather than necessarily an ideal job or one that sort of fits with what they at least initially envisioned themselves pursuing. So I think patience is one issue in particular. There's another sense of coming to grips with being honest with yourself and trying to do what's really good for you rather than doing what other folks may want you to do. And that's one of those sort of risky topics that people across both editions have been willing to acknowledge publicly. But the whole idea of most graduate programs, I think, do a very, very good job of helping people understand themselves and who they are. We probably could work a little harder in graduate preparation programs to help people be able to move into new environments and sort of assess quickly and assess thoroughly, in some ways comprehensively, sort of the culture of these other places. And so while folks would visit campus, visit websites, I don't know that as I listen to their stories, they always optimally gathered the kind of information that might be useful to them until after they got there and figured out some of these things. The other things just that I think are very, very obvious to folks, I think the importance of relationships is very, very important. And it would be hard to find any of the stories over the last two editions that didn't talk about implicitly or explicitly relationships. I think this whole idea of fit is something that people came to understand a little bit later rather than sooner, usually on the job rather than in the job thing. And I think the last one I'd say, turning over to Jill, is really sort of the gap between, I think, people's competence and their confidence. I think in our profession sometimes we have a lot of many folks who are extremely competent, but given, I think, a lot of the different issues converging on this, on the job search process or getting a start, their confidence seems to wane at times, and that gap, I think, creates some anxiety. It creates some pretty odd dynamics, and so those are some of the things I think about as graduate preparation programs and supervisors, at least topics to talk a little bit more extensively about.
That's great. Jill, I know we've had one question from Twitter that actually follows my next question pretty closely. Zeb Davenport asked about 2 to 3 tips for upper administrators who to help make the most of new professionals' experiences. And I was going to basically ask, for those folks who supervise new professionals, how can we be better at kind of fostering a culture that helps those folks both participate in that process of self-discovery as well as become better professionals along the way? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that supervision piece.
Yeah, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And because Peter and I are getting ready for the Mabel Institute, one of the things we talk about is synergistic supervision, and I don't know who all, Joan, Kurt, and Steve Saunders, there's a bunch of folks that put that together. And, the whole orientation and transition in is what we've talked about. But then when it comes to supervision, I think Doug's question is interesting because I think upper administration with new professionals, whatever upper administration is, and those who supervise new professionals can be very different. And I think some of us that are a little more gray than others and have been around the block a few times just take it too much for granted that you hire the right people, they come in, they're going to do the job, everything you've done in the past is going to work. And then for the supervisor, the new professional, when I saw this question, I kind of said, what's the best thing and what's the worst thing? Because I think all too often, supervisors of new professionals, it's great that they're often close in age, they're still recent enough to remember being a new professional, and they know how they wanted to be treated as a new professional. Excuse me. I think some of the more difficult or challenging these mid-level folks that usually are supervising new, they may not have had any formal training or education of what it means to be a supervisor. How can I be a good supervisor? How could being a supervisor vary between, you know, 3 new hires at the same time that each may need something different? And if they've never done it before, I was way more insecure 30, 40 years ago than I am now, and had a much higher need to be liked back then. Not that I wouldn't want to be liked now, but for me now it's more serving the undergraduate student population. So, you know, I don't think we can assume that somebody coming into your organization even really knows how to be a supervisee. I mean, it's in my mind, it's a two-way street, but how do you kind of take the time when they come in, and having been in residential life for so long, I mean, it's a machine. You hire X amount of people, usually the turnover, here's the training we're going to go through, here's what we're going to do. And I've seen some staff be more thoughtful and do more of an assessment each year and figure out what are the differences, what are some of the conversations that need to carry over for an entire year, and how do we allow the new professional to come in, find his or her or their place, and to move forward, but to have the support that they need with it. And I think all too often we don't pay enough attention to that. And Peter and I have found out over the course of the last couple of years with the Mabel Institute, some of these new professionals that could just be absolutely fabulous given the right setting and environment. So many obstacles are thrown up to them that I remember one individual who reported to 3 different individuals for different tasks, and they didn't even all report up to the same director. That's destined for failure. It's difficult enough to establish a solid relationship with a new person. And, I mean, how do we view people coming into our profession as, yes, we're paying them, yes, we're giving them an equitable rate, but they're our future and interact probably on the ground most directly with the population that we're all here to serve.
That's great. That's a great point. So Zeb's question was specifically around upper administration, you know, who maybe not directly working with new professionals in that context. But Jill, I know in your role, you may not be supervising new professionals, but how do you then support supervisors? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that too. Kind of culture, I guess. It's more of a culture discussion.
And I think that's where you look beyond you as an individual, but what does a division or a department or a unit do for new professionals? And you may be a dean, a director, some type of department chair, but what kind of orientation? And probably everybody's got better examples than what I'm familiar with, but to really bring new professionals together to meet with, first of all, just getting to know everybody. And who they are, who they can call on, what expectations do you set up? It could be a social, it could be a professional development, but and how do you get out and meet folks? And what some staff have started to do throughout the semester is to bring senior level administrators together to have conversations about campus culture or what was new or different. I mean, Molly, you and I are at the same institution, so when you think about, you know, kind of be direct, but how upper administration was part of your transition in or not so much?
Yeah, sure.
I think definitely exposure to higher administration is really important, whether it be through kind of more of a casual setting, like going out to lunch or a coffee, and I think that extension goes really far, and there's a sense of really feeling a part of a place when you have an upper level administrator kind of reach out to you. And when I think about kind of mid-level management and where I've seen it go really well is when there are, I think, clear kind of expectations around, I think things that I've seen young professionals and myself included struggle with is a lot of the interpersonal kind of conflicts or things that happen with colleagues, and how do you navigate that, and how do you navigate it in a professional manner and a constructive manner. And I think often a good supervisor coaches you through that process, but really puts it on you to give it a try, and doesn't necessarily manage it for you. So I think, and I think you learn a lot through that process, even though it might be challenging or might not fit your style at first. But I've experienced personal growth through that, and also through colleagues having had that experience, and to have a supervisor who's willing to kind of give you the space to give it a try, and then come back and kind of get advice and kind of coach you through that.
That's great.
You know, and Heather, I mean, I can't help to think back of how I entered as a new professional and who I am today. And people who know me will not believe that I probably hardly spoke my first year, because I think I was just so shell-shocked, moving to the West Coast, taking everything in, having great colleagues who were resident directors who really provided me leadership at the peer level. And then I had a supervisor that really probably charted my course to be in this field, because I had incredible respect for her. She made me think way more long-term, more critically. When I had the decision and this is what was going to happen, because I was much more of a dualistic, she'd flip the coin or multiple coins over. And I think, I mean, that's left a lasting impression on me, over all these years. And I could see why some people come into the field and go, lifelong learning, not so much. Or I go back to job one and think of one individual that really felt she had much more responsibility and ability to think critically, autonomously, independently when I'm her grad assistant and when she ended up in her first job. So how do you reconcile those differences?
Yeah. Yeah, I know when I was reading the book, I spent a lot of time thinking about my first experience, and so how we have changed and evolved and putting ourselves back in those shoes. I am curious, Peter, what was your first job like in student affairs, and what did you do?
It would be quite a long time ago, but I was a hall director back then it was Ohio State University, but I believe now it's the Ohio State University, and spent 3 years in that position in a residence hall of the actual building had 2,000 residents, and I was only responsible for 1,100. There were 92 to a floor and 16 to a suite, and so that opportunity provided me an awful lot of insights about the profession, and it probably reminded me also of how important supervisors are in those sort of positions, because it was a very, very challenging position, and having somebody who's available on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis to sort of process those experiences, I think were extremely important and influential. Interestingly, the project I'm working on right now is an ethnographic study of campus custodians and what the university looks like from the vantage point. And actually, the book I'm dedicating the book to one of the housekeeping managers during my first job, who probably played a major influential role in providing me some insights about supervision. And so even though she passed away, I remain very close to her family and really feel like this is the last major project. And so part of when I think about supervision as well, we talk a lot about mentors, we talk a lot about former supervisors, but there's an awful lot of wisdom that exists all around us, and sometimes I don't think we take advantage of that wisdom. I was fortunate enough to stumble upon a few folks who I was fortunate enough to just sort of observe and learn about being honest and straightforward and those kinds of things. The one thing I would say about supervision that honestly surprises me, and this is one of these annual events, annual epiphanies that I have, I don't know why no one can remember, but at the Naval Institute, I'm always sort of disappointed and surprised that folks can go through an entire academic year with only meeting maybe once or twice formally with their supervisors. I find that sort of astonishing. Now, many of them meet and do informal kinds of things, but one of the things I've learned from listening to folks' stories, especially during these institutes, is the folks who have carved out formal time, even if they don't think they need it, to just talk about what's going on and not waiting for a crisis. Those types of interactions are very, very powerful and mutually beneficial, I think, both to the supervisor as well as to new professionals. And so that's one thing for me as I think about supervisors too. And I know everyone's busy and there's lots of different sort of crises that sort of guide and can sometimes direct what we do, but carving out time regularly for that particular one-on-one or small group functioning, I get a sense is really, really important.
I could not agree more. In my 15 years in student affairs, I've had a lot of interesting supervisory experiences, but I think the ones that I have had the most connection to have made time for me, right? And it's not just when there's a crisis or when I absolutely need to talk to them. So all the supervisors who are watching, your new professionals and entry-level staff, and even your mid-level professionals need dedicated time. We should do a whole higher ed live show just about supervision. I think that would be a fascinating discussion about best practices. Peter, you alluded actually earlier in our conversation about the economic downturn, and I'm curious because in the preface of the book you talk a lot about the changing nature of student affairs work based on factors that are beyond our control, and how those factors have impacted new professionals, and the economy is certainly one, technology is another. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit about that and what changed maybe between the first edition of the book and the second edition?
Sure, and we joke about that in the book, but when ACPA approached us a few years ago about the second edition, our initial reaction was thanks, but no thanks. But mostly because at first sort of glance at that opportunity, it seemed like the stories that we had told still seem to ring true today, and even despite the fact that the book had been published 6 or 7 years ago, folks still found it useful. So we went out and began to talk to some folks about the possibility, and mostly new professionals. And one of the things that became very clear to both of us is that a lot has changed, dramatically changed, on a very macro level that have micro influences on new professionals. And so as we talked a few minutes ago, just sort of the very sort of turbulent worldwide economy creates a sense of anxiety and influences the ways in which people approach jobs, the ways in which people sort of feel like getting a job is more important than getting the ideal job, and that shapes kinds of opportunities they pursue. Clearly, I mean, we could spend another full show on technology and social media, but even the ways in which people use Skype now to do some preliminary interviews with folks, the ways in which people can electronically share information, the whole idea of networking, all of these sort of technologies have dramatically changed the job search process, but they also changed job one for many folks because people don't have, for example, hall meetings the same way as many of us sponsored and encouraged folks to organize years ago. And so the ways in which people communicate with each other, all of those technologies have dramatically altered the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we interact with folks and really do our jobs. And so those two things in particular, clearly I think the demographics have also sort of influenced our job as well. I know, for example, we have a lot of graduate students in the Learning Center in assistantships. And for example, because so many international students are joining our campus each year and enrolling, the nature of helping provide academic support is very different today than it was 2 and 3 years ago. And so in all of these sort of micro positions as well, there's a lot of larger macro issues that are influencing. But the one that probably is the one I think most about is sort of around links to the economy also, sort of this corporatization of the university because of these economic times. So you constantly will hear things around outsourcing, downsizing, and those things have a dramatic influence because if you have 7 colleagues and all of a sudden you downsize and you have 5, and we all know there's not less work, That changes both our work environment, but it also changes our psyche in terms of how we approach our job and the ways in which we can do issues as well. So that's one of the things that's really difficult in our graduate program, to help people understand of not to become obsessed with these macro issues, but recognizing that there's a lot of things outside of higher education and outside of student affairs that have a dramatic influence on the ways in which we do our jobs, and to be to be cognizant of those, and also to be able to be advocates for some changes in some modest ways to those as well.
Great, thank you. Molly, do you want to share a little bit about how some of those changes in society have impacted you personally?
I think some of it is, kind of proving your worth a little. I think as things kind of are evolving and changing, I think a lot about how assessment has been a growing piece of kind of my experience as a young professional. And whenever I have a new idea or new initiative, there's kind of the question of why, like why are we changing it? Why are we putting resources here? And so I think that's definitely been a new skill set that when I started out in the field, I wasn't anticipating would be such an important one, but it's something that I know has kind of impacted kind of how I approach my work, and I think it makes sense. Like, I think showing what your work can accomplish is really important, but I think it also can be a challenge, because there are a lot of things I think that we do in our jobs that you ask yourself, how can we quantify this, or how can we qualify this? And I think that it can be a challenge that takes time, and I think when you're already kind of stretched and kind of trying to just achieve and trying to get programs in place and experiences in place, that sometimes the assessment of that can kind of take kind of second place. And I think that it can serve as being really important as you're kind of proving kind of the work that you're doing, and maybe work that you want to do for your student population. So that piece is really important.
And as much as some things change, maybe they stay the same. However, when I think about the whole risk management piece, I feel like that's just been ratcheted up, and how institutions are more risk averse, probably as we should be. I mean, it probably wasn't that long ago when students would go on various spring break trips, and we'd say, great, have a good time, come back and tell us, what happened. Now it's, what have they signed, what's the list, what's the roster, what are all the sign-offs, what are the waivers. You get it, well, and I understand now with these bouncy houses, every week one is blowing away, but you're going to sign a waiver before you do about anything. And I think, at least in my experience, I think the whole sexual assault, Title IX, Green Dot training, we've only begun to really touch on that, and I think we've got a lot of people that are dancing as quickly as they can about new regulations and the Dear Colleague letter and the different pieces, and some of us still stuck with Title IX with athletics and what, in the White House papers. But, I mean, how then do we, as student affairs professional, whether we're new, mid, old, whatever, really take those and follow them, obviously, but how do we follow them in relationship to the institution we're a part of, and what's the context, climate, place that may work at Michigan State but not at Miami and different at WashU. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, how are we required to be more critical thinkers and think more broadly and more long-term outside of our department or division, but then how do we set that, how do we assist in setting that mindset for new professionals as they come in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this actually relates to our topic of socialization, too, of how we socialize folks into the profession, and certainly our preparation programs, I think, play a big role in that. But very infrequently do people graduate from a professional preparation program at Colorado State and stay there, right? So how do professional preparation programs as well as professional associations help to address some of these perennial issues, overarching themes, but then also help new graduates adapt to the changing environment as well as to their campus needs? Peter, since you're at a professional prep program. Maybe you could kind of lead on this and talk further.
Sure. I mean, when I think about the changing nature of higher education, one quickly realizes that most of what we teach becomes obsolete rather quickly. And so I think a lot of our efforts are not necessarily around educating people about specific content. We do that, but we really are our primary interest is getting folks intellectually curious about things, about topics, so that once they go out into whatever it is they do, they can continue learning over the next 30 or 40 years, because the finite knowledge that most of these academic programs provide really won't help folks as much as we'd like to believe they are, even though that's, at least in my world, my livelihood. And so this whole idea of sort of lifelong learning, and also I think remaining sort of up to date on different kinds of issues, and I think Jill alluded to some of them as it relates to risk management and other kinds of things as well. And what I see is a really, it's easy for us, I think, to become very pessimistic about the economy and other kinds of things as well, but I also think there's some opportunities that exist in this as well. So, for example, on our campus, there's an entrepreneurial spirit which is sort of taking hold, which is basically trying to find some new revenue streams to offset money that's not there. And so this, I think, even this little show today is a wonderful example of a professional development opportunity that didn't exist 6 and 7 years ago. And so I think there's opportunities for faculty folks in the summer to sponsor an online sort of course, which may generate some revenue, but it also, more importantly, can generate some learning and some discussions around more contemporary topics, and use, again, the wisdom that exists all over the world, not necessarily on one particular campus. And I think we're beginning to find our way, both through technology and for our own comfort in teaching in new ways. But clearly, I think preparation programs, I think, are going to have to think beyond just the traditional 2-year type of program. And then I think professional associations can, have in the past and will continue to really provide these voids that I believe are more pronounced now. And so these kinds of opportunities that we talk about with ACPA's New Professional Institute and many of the other associations have similar programs, trying to find opportunities to bring people together face-to-face or and through some virtual worlds to continue this process of learning. So I think it's really, in some ways, it's sort of exciting to rethink about different ways my job may involve teaching and learning, but also associations' jobs of thinking beyond national annual conventions as opportunities to teach and learn, but to think about that on a day-to-day basis.
Great, great. Jill, your thoughts on this? I know you've been really involved in professional association work.
And I think now, when you mentioned that, Heather and then Peter talked about lifelong learning, I think now more than ever, as I'm near more the end of my career than the beginning, professional associations are as important, if not more so. And I was fortunate enough from this amazing supervisor I had to begin with, Pat Harney, that was part and parcel of her life. So over the years, not only I always call it my professional vacation, and sometimes I knock the, what I did on my summer vacation is some of the program sessions. I want to go deep into theory and models and all that, but the professional associations I've been a part of, they really are part and parcel of my career and my life, and I think they've assisted in making me who I am, better or worse. I'll give them the better parts. But to be involved and to learn what other places are doing on particular topics, and knowing that, with a phone call, or it seems now more an email, to say, okay, what have you done with companion animals? What are you doing with informing with crisis management? And those relationships to me are critical, and they've existed longer than most of the relationships I've had as I've moved around the country. But the importance of them, and I don't think you need to be at an institute. You can't use the excuse that my institution doesn't have a dime. How do you go about on your own, as Peter mentioned, even with this session? I don't know how many pearls of wisdom we've given in the last 55 minutes or so, but but what are others that are available that you can really learn, or it's going to trigger something, or I heard something different. I mean, on a listserv today, somebody's talking about community gardens. I could give I don't care about community gardens right now, what I'm involved in, but just for people to even know what the term is, what it means, what institutions are doing it, possible answers. If you're a good kind of qualitative researcher and critical thinker, you can have 10 different ideas in about 45 minutes and then call Emory, call Seattle and say, okay, what do you really do?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we live in a much more complex and complicated world, but with a lot more information. How do we try to figure that out what's too much?
Yeah. Jill, your point about community gardens makes me laugh, because for those of you who know me, my current position at Michigan State is working with the MSU RISE program, which we have a garden. I spent half of my day yesterday planting tomatoes, so oh, I love it. So I'm just noticing our time, and I'd like to kind of close out with some final thoughts, and here maybe in your final comments, just any classic mistakes that you think new professionals sometimes make, and how to overcome those. Any words of wisdom based on the three of your experiences, and also from the authors of the book that you'd like to share. Molly, do you want to start?
Sure. I think my one word of advice would be acknowledge and be aware of others' perceptions of you as a new professional, and I think be open to hearing it. I often think about you come into a space and you think you're coming across a certain way, and then the first time you hear that that's not how someone perceived or saw you, you have this like moment of defensiveness of like, no, this is what I was intending. But I think that those perceptions are just as important, and I think working with a supervisor, a mentor, or even colleagues about how to acknowledge those perceptions, but also how to adapt and kind of meet kind of that environment that you're a part of, and that's just as important as what maybe your intentions are going into it.
You know, and Heather, you gave us this question ahead of time, and I mean, the thing is about classic mistakes, I'm not sure they're just for the new professionals. So how, as people make mistakes, how do you assume a tone of goodwill around or assume the best? Because I think when you're new, how do you think about entering and showing up? I mean, some of what you said, Molly. And I think sometimes if you've only known one place, you assume every place is the same. So, how do you navigate? How are you not too timid yet not make too many assumptions? I mean, I think the best, I've got a whole list of mistakes that probably half of them I've made in the last week or so, but I think is, as Peter said, I hate giving advice, but how do you be authentic, true to yourself, show up, and the whole piece that we started with about what competencies do you have, but then how does your confidence, how do you gain confidence as a new professional, and that you're not, when you start at a new place, you're not starting as a new individual. What stories, what strengths, what expertise, what literature, what do you bring with you, and how do you present it more in asking questions and soliciting information, of being, a good investigator before all of a sudden it's wrong and we've got to start over. Assume that the people are there ahead of you really attempted to do their best. They may have failed in some areas, but then how do you, coming into the place, say, I'm going to take it from here, I'm going to learn what worked and what didn't, and then how to move forward. Peter?
That light just came back on. I just wanted to make one comment to what you just said, Jill, because I think that was a really critical point. And actually, there's a whole movement on the SA Chat Twitter hashtag right now around failing forward. And I think creating organizational cultures that are okay sometimes with failure is a really critical piece for new professionals, that they don't have to be worried sometimes about making those mistakes in their first jobs. So, Peter?
Just a couple maybe closing thoughts. Gary Miller wrote a chapter in the 2.0 text that I think about quite often because the beginning of her story sounded very familiar, where an individual ends up in a particular work context and it doesn't seem to be as much like Camelot as they envisioned. And clearly, I think sometimes new professionals spend an awful lot of time documenting how bad the situation is, and many times they have lots of empirical evidence to suggest it's not so good. I think where her story deviates from so many others I've heard is how she took it upon herself to not simply just complain about what isn't, but to really act on things that matter to her. So in her instance, it was about professional development, and felt there really wasn't as much professional development and enough stimulation as she had hoped, and then took it upon herself to enroll in some classes at a nearby university and developed a different kind of network and some different kinds of attachments that ultimately helped her in her relationships with her supervisor, as well as, I think, day-to-day with her students. And so the whole idea of agency, of folks having the capacity to in some way shape some parts of their work experiences that may not be ideal. So to me, that's one thing that chapter gets me, I think about a lot, and I invite other folks to think about it. And the last thing for me, I think, has a lot to do with something that I encounter day in and day out when I interview folks for graduate programs, as well as serving on search committees for new professionals, is that I think as a profession we're really good at telling people what we did. We're not as good at telling folks what we learned and how what we learned we might apply to a future context. And so for me, typically I read people's resumes before they arrive, so I know what they did. A more valuable use of our time together is really around what the person learned as a result of those experiences. And so I think as people think about graduate school, as people think about new jobs, or even introducing themselves to folks, to focus a lot more on learning rather than necessarily what we do. I think in many ways that begin conversations and begin relationships, because we know those are important, that are really rooted in learning rather than just sort of accomplishments. And so those are just a couple things I think about inviting folks to think further about.
Great. Oh my gosh, this is a fabulous show today. I am so thankful to the three of you for joining me on Student Affairs Live. And also want to thank our program sponsors, mStoner. And just want to remind folks that Student Affairs Live airs live every 2 weeks here. So Chris Butler, my co-host, will be back on June 18th. And you can get reminders about this show and other Higher Ed Live shows on the newsletter. And also subscribe to our iTunes account and get this podcast delivered directly to your phone. So my name is Heather Shea Gasser, and I'll be back again in July with more Student Affairs Live. And until then, have a fabulous day and a great summer. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you.
Thank you.